This should be my third video about turbochargers. I thought I was doing just one, but here's third. I doubt there'll be a fourth, but you never know. I wrote things down. Turbochargers our superchargers were first, and then exhaust-driven superchargers were called turbo superchargers up and through the World War II era, and then it just became turbochargers. Being mechanically driven with the engine, a supercharger can have boost all the time, and instant response. That's why all your drag racing vehicles have the big, huge superchargers on top. But they're also pulling power the entire time to be driven, even when you don't need them. You're going down a hill, the supercharger's still getting fed. It's still taking power from the engine. Turbocharger, it's just winding down, not doing a thing. So instant, tremendous response. Supercharger's your thing. Stop watching this. Go find a supercharger. Talking 6.2, 6.5 diesels. There is a supercharger out there. I'm not getting into that. I'm talking turbochargers for those trucks, the 6.2 and 6.5 diesels. And the other thing is that superchargers can't compensate for altitude. You can only spin it with the pulley. You got spinning so much. If you can survive, if the engine won't blow up at sea level, you get to 10,000 feet, the supercharger is not going to increase your power as you go higher. A turbocharger, if you give it more fuel, make more heat, it spins up. It'll spin a lot higher. When I had the cow dog out in Colorado a year and a half ago, we were doing some trails outside the town of Creed, and I actually pulled out of the way for someone in a little razor to go by. Those things are kind of annoying on the trails, but if I was in one, I'd be annoyed at the big trucks. Anyway, I pulled out of the way and got myself kind of in a little rut, and we're above 10,000 feet now, I think. And I gave it the power to go, and we just kind of did nothing. And the wind was behind us. This big, huge black cloud engulfed the entire truck. I'm giving all the power I got, but no, the turbo's not spinning yet. So I gave it more power just to pop it on out of there. Different way of driving the mountains. All right. 6.2 and 6.5 diesel turbocharging. When you think about the 6.2s and 6.5s, they are indirect injection diesels. And they were made to get good gas mileage. That's it. That's what they were made for. Think back to the late 1970s. Carter's president. The second oil embargo of 79 goes on when the Shah of Iran left the country and Iran turned the country it is now. Still is, all this time later. But fuel prices, gasoline was $1.20, $1.30, $1.50 a gallon by the summer of 80. And diesel, the federal government hadn't gone nuts taxing it yet, and the state governments had either. You can still get diesel for 50 or 60 cents a gallon. So with like the 6.2s for sure, Chevrolet or General Motors. General Motors owned Detroit Diesel. Detroit Diesel, that's a whole other story about how Detroit Diesel was made by General Motors to make diesel engines. And so they went to Detroit Diesel, so to make us an engine that fits wherever a big block or small block gas engine fits. So if a 350 or 44 will fit there, make the new diesel fit there. And make it have the same performance as a stock V8. In 1982, the stock V8 for a Chevrolet truck was a 305 two-barrel. 105 horsepower, 160 pounds of torque. A 6.2 does that, but gets twice the fuel mileage. That's what Chevrolet wanted. Same power, twice the fuel mileage. The 6.2 does that exactly. And 40 years ago, it was the thing. Well, 40 years. A little bit different attitude now. Indirect injection diesel. the way to add power, we've talked about this in other videos, but you're mixing fuel and air to make an explosion inside the engine. If you can get more air in, you can get more fuel in, bigger explosion, more power for the engine. Turbochargers do that. This is a GM8 turbo. I keep inside Whitey here. And this is I don't know what turbo this is. It's off. Who made this? It's a Borg Warner. Huh. It was remanufactured in 2007 for the M35 truck. This is a D model turbo for the Deuce and a Half, the LDS 465 engine. I got it just to show the difference in the mounting flanges. This is where the GM turbo mounts, and this is where the Deuce and a Half turbo mounts. Totally different, but it's a standardized size. This is called a T3. The GM 6.2 or 6.5 turbos, T3. I don't know what this one is. I didn't look up and measure it. I'm just saying this is a T3. It's the same mounting flange that the 6BT 12 valves use. It's also the same mounting flange that Banks uses on the 6.2 kit. So if you get into the turbo world, you can swap between different turbos. You can't swap these two on the same spot because they won't bolt up. But the GM, there's a 4, a 5, a 6, 7, 8, whatever. There's several different GM turbos. Then you get all the ones used on the 12 valve Cummins 6BT. You can find a turbo that might fit your needs if you don't like what you have. One thing I pointed out on the Banks turbo for the 6.2 is you get the Ford 6.9 turbo from Banks that has a wastegate, and it'll bolt on to where the 6.2 turbo is. You have a different exhaust output, downpipe, but you get more turbo. All right, let me go back to the script here. All right, you have a turbine section. See the aluminum on both of them. This is where air comes in, gets compressed, and then gets sent out to the engine. This turbine and this turbine are obviously totally different sizes and shapes. And I'm not getting into the numbers and ratios and whatnots that make these two different. And the turbine section, this is the compressor. The turbine section here on the exhaust side, obviously these two are very different. But the shape of that wheel, the size of that housing, shape of this wheel inside, size of this housing, shape of this wheel, size of this housing, all those are variables that you can change around on different turbos to get different performance profiles. I'm not trying to get into that. I'm just saying you can jump in with both feet into the turbo world and get lost beyond all recognition. Not know reality anymore because you can start mismatching turbos. But to make it work on a 6.2 or 6.5, you have to have the exhaust manifold, obviously, either the Banks or the GM one that goes on the passenger side. I talked about that in my other video. But once you get the turbo on there, then you have to get the air to the engine. And the big limiting factor for a 6.2 or 6.5 engine is 1,200 degrees. Your exhaust temperature should not exceed 1,200 degrees right before the turbo. So right here, right there, right before the turbo, you need to put a EGT, exhaust gas temperature gauge, pyrometer, and have a gauge. And so if you put a turbo on an engine, have a pyrometer, 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 however you want to say it. 1,200 degrees. That's your limit. That's how hot the exhaust is going into the turbine section of the turbo. General rule of thumb is if you're above that, back in the engine, you'll start melting pistons. So don't want to go above that. Now to help out with that, the 6.5, the GEP 6.5, 6500, meant for the turbo, well, all the GEP blocks, are drilled on the main bearings, they have a little squirter squirt at the bottom of the pistons. So every time the crankshaft goes by, it squirts oil on the bottom of the pistons. It cools the pistons. It takes away a little bit of oil pressure, but it's called a piston. There's a little bit, there's on my engine that I redid, there's little bitty nozzles that squirt at the piston. It's really kind of interesting. But it doesn't mean you go past 1200 degrees. It just means it's going to help a little bit. The way you stay below 1200 degrees is power. The more fuel you put in, the more heat you make. If you start inching up, you back out of the power. It's simple as that. You get off the fuel on a diesel engine, and everything slows down, and you get no more heat. But what if you want to climb that hill faster, like I did with my cow dog when I was in a first time I really challenged that truck was out in the Guadalupe Mountains National Park 3 years ago now. I was driving 83 miles an hour on cruise control for 500 miles to get there in the cow dog. I got to 800 degrees a couple times on climbing the big hills out west of Kerrville in the Van Horn area. Doing great. My engine coolant temperature never got above 206, 207. EGTs never got above 900 degrees for a second or two. And we went through Van Horn up to Guadalupe Mountains National Park at Guadalupe Pass. Well, that pass, you gain almost 4,000 feet in about 3 miles. I didn't know that. And I'm trying to run the speed limit. And my EGTs went over to 1100. I started getting flashing engine coolant temperature. And my boost was up around 11 or 12. I just backed off. I drove by EGT. I backed off the throttle and tried to keep the power at 900 degrees on the EGT gauge. I didn't want to burn my engine up. And I was down to 25 miles an hour at one point. I did not downshift. I had not driven that truck in the mountains before. That was my first time going up a big mountain pass. And I didn't like it. I'm not going to slow down. There are people waiting for me to hurry up and get out of the way behind me. That's not right. I got my turbo diesel truck. I need to go. So after that, I installed methanol injection. The snow methanol injection. I was thinking the other way to do it is intercooler. My other video I talk about how intercoolers are actually aftercoolers, and they're air-to-air coolers that cool the charge air. Only thing is, they are very, very inefficient below 15 to 18 psi. If you get above on the 6.2 or 6.5, if you get above 11 or 12 psi with a stock engine, it probably will not remain together very long, because the head bolts are torque to yield bolts, which means they actually stretch as part of the installation process. They might stretch some more under that pressure. The stock GM engine has main web bearing issues, or main bearing webbing issues, the bolts that hold the crankshaft on. And your cylinder head temperature will get very, very high with the boost above that. The general engine products, the GEP engines, they have different main bearing webbing, smaller bolts actually, that are stronger because they have 2 of them on each side. There's 4 bolts per main bearing cap, and the webbing is stronger. They have the piston squirters, but they're still the torque to yield bolts. So if you want to run more than 11 or 12 psi boost, then you need to put in head studs. Head studs are a whole other problem. One, if you put them in the square body Chevy truck, you can't pull the heads off without pulling the studs inside the truck. You got to pull the engine to pull the heads, or you have to pull the studs back out. Well, the studs go into water jackets, which means you took a supposedly not leaking fitting, When you put the head back on, you have to put sealant on those bolts, put them back in there again, get them right through the cylinder head, and not get sealant all over the cylinder head. Hopefully the sealant makes it down into the engine and actually keeps the coolant on that side of the threads. I was not planning on racing my cow dog truck, so I did not do that. I did not do ARP head studs. I just did the torque to yield bolts. I try to keep below 12 psi, because what happened out Guadalupe Pass, I did the Nitrous Express snow methanol injection kit, and now I drove 1,000 miles around Colorado a year and a half ago. I learned that keep the RPM above 2,000 for me, my engine. RPM up, and with the methanol injection pumping, I don't get above over 800, 900 degrees on the big passes out there. Getting up to 11, 12,000 feet, just go with the RPMs up. RPMs down, boost is down, and EGTs go up. Higher the boost, for me, on my engine without an intercooler, with the methanol injection, the more RPM I have, the more boost I get, the lower the EGTs. It's kind of an interesting thing there. All right. Because the 6.2 and the 6.5 were made for fuel mileage, not for power, they have a 21.5 to 1 compression ratio, as in the piston squeezes in 21.5 to 1 compression ratio. If you want to run more than 12 or so psi boost, you want to use an intercooler, and it's hard to fit one of those on these engines with air conditioning on the front cowling. Change the pistons. Go to 18 to 1 marine pistons, and then you can run 20 to 25 psi boost through an intercooler, and you're good. But then the engine becomes boost dependent. 6.2 and 6.5 are not boost dependent. That's the whole deal with the GM turbo and the Banks turbo. Is, I think Banks actually says going 60 on the instruction manual, and they were an option for the GMCs back in the late 80s, early 90s. So they had lots of experience with this. Going down the highway at 60 miles an hour, you should be 400 to 500 degrees exhaust gas temperature and 0 to 2 pounds of boost at 60 miles an hour. That's it, very low boost. Then you get to a hill, it'll shoot right up. You drive a Power Stroke, or I guess I've never driven a Duramax or any of the Cummins engines, the direct injection engines, they have boosted idle just sitting there. And you're always using boost going. A whole different dynamic. The more boost you use, also the more fuel you use. It's weird that way. When my boost is up, my fuel consumption's down when climbing mountains and stuff. On the open highway, if I'm at 2 to 3 psi boost, I've gotten over 20 miles a gallon on the cow dog. Of course, that was from Colorado Springs to the Panhandle of Texas. There's a little bit of downhill there, but normally I'm in the 17 to 19 range on the open highway, running 70 to 80 without much boost. The more boost I have in uphill situations or passing people, the lower my fuel mileage. A steady boost of 2 or 3 psi, I get really good mileage. All right, like I said, the direct injection, Duramax, Power Stroke, and Cummins are all boost dependent. The 6.2 and 6.5, because of the high compression ratio and the indirect injection, the boost is not going to be all the time. They have enough oomph for the compression ratio to get you around and going and whatnot. And in fact, my boost doesn't come on until if I'm really on the power on the cow dog, maybe when it shifts a second, it might pop up to like half a psi, then go back down. When it shifts to third, it'll pop up to 1 to 1.5 and might go down to 0.5 to 1. Depends how hard I am with the power. That's when the engine's going and we got momentum. Get above 2,000 RPM and stay there. So there has to be a load and higher RPM to get boost on a 6.2 or 6.5. It's a weird. It's different than the newer trucks. Uh, Back to the indirect injection. There's something called pre-combustion chambers, and I got a couple of cylinder heads in there. They're at the bottom of a stack of a bunch of parts. I didn't want to get them out. they're the pre-combustion chambers. They have markings on them, and there's the one dot. There's this little dot, and the one dot I think is the smallest one. Little itty bitty throat between the where the glow plug and the injector are to get the fuel, the fire over to above the piston. To what I have in the cow dog is the diamond pre-cups, which is a huge, about the size of, I can probably put my pinky in there. It's huge. The smaller the pre-cup, the more miles per gallon you get non-turbo, but the hotter the head gets with a turbo. And conceivably less power with a turbo. So if you're building an engine, the diamond pre-cups are the ones for turbo, but they're loud. The cow dog is just clank, 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 clank. It's a very loud combustion process compared to the normal 6.2s and 6.5s. I already talked about after cooler, air charged air cooler not being that efficient below 15 psi. So the snow performance methanol injection really kept me below 900. And in fact, when I was out in Colorado, around here I have it come on at 5 psi boost. I don't really do that much boost around here. Out in Colorado, I set a 3 psi boost. And after doing a couple, one pass called Slim Mulligan Pass between Creed and Lake City, I was down to, I don't know, 20 miles an hour. I had downshifted. And I was 2,500 RPM, and I was just riding the 900 degrees because I had the thing is, every time the methanol injection would come on, I would drop down to around 600 degrees. But then I left the power for a curve, and it would turn off, and I'd go back up again. I lowered my threshold on my snow injection, methanol injection, to 3 psi, and that kept on pretty much all the time in Colorado. And I'm just, by the time we were done with that trip, I was zooming up passes and coming back down again. Used a whole lot of water, but I had power. I was going. Comes back to coolant. That same trip with the turbo, the 6.2, the indirect injection head, there's a lot of heat in that head. And when you have a lot of boost, about, for my engine at least, 10 to 20 seconds later, if you're in the boost, you have to downshift and get on the power or passing or whatever, the cruise control decides to do that. About 10 to 20 seconds later, my temperature gauge starts going up. Now, growing up with gas engines, I've always, anything above 210, and at one point up there, I was at 218, 219. It's like, oh man, I'm gonna burn my engine up. Then my Heath super duper fan clutch kicked in, and it's like an airplane was landing on top of me, and it cooled down to 195, just right on down. But after that trip, I got back to the civilization of the internet. GM does not consider the 6.2 hot until you get over 225. The Humvees, their pneumatic fan or hydraulic controlled fan clutch doesn't kick into 228 degrees. So it's a different way of thinking with the 6.2s and 6.5s. If you have the fan and a good fan clutch and a known good cooling system, as in it's clean, not all cruded up, hitting 220 is not that big a deal. GM has no problem with it. The 4L80E transmission, I was free. I normally have, on summer days, I'm normally in the 168 to 174 degree range going down the highway. That one trail where I said I had this big black clouds and I was sitting still coming out of my truck, I got to 220. Oh, 208 on the transmission temperature. I was like, oh, I put it in neutral. I sat there for a few minutes, let it cool down. I was all worried. Looked it up. It doesn't even go into limp mode until 275 to 275 degrees for the transmission temperature. So I was worried about getting over 200. different way of looking at it. But these engines, the 6.2s and 6.5s, they're different than gas engines. And yes, they are a totally diesel design engine. But 215, 220 degrees coolant temperature with a healthy cooling system and a good pressure cap. And make sure you have a recovery overflow, a big enough coolant overflow reservoir. That's not a problem with these engines. So I think that's all I really wanted to say about the turbo. Is if you're planning on turbocharging a 6.2 or 6.5, know the limitations. It's not a race engine. You are probably never going to beat a 12 valve Cummins. You're probably never going to beat towing or anything else, any kind of performance measure besides miles per gallon. A Super Duty or a Power Stroke or a Cummins or a Duramax. However, cost involved, these things are a whole lot cheaper and they're a whole lot simpler. And I got a buddy who has a 16 Duramax. I get text every now and then, hey, I got this code, what's it mean? I got this code, what's it mean? 6.2s and 6.5s. They're not the Power Kings, but they are the Simplicity Kings. Anyway, hope I didn't ramble too much. Hopefully that concludes my turbocharger talk, but I wanted to get those all out there.